a bunch of my clients right now are either thinking about starting a podcast or have just started a podcast. And if they're listening to this episode or anyone listening to this episode is in the same spot that they are, there are a few things that you must know before you get started. And those things are
Welcome back to Endless Customers. I'm your host, Alex Winter, and today we are joined by Lindsay Otten. She's a coach and trainer here at Impact. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me back, guys. It's been too long.
It has been way too long. We've missed you. We got a lot to talk about. We're usually talking about video with you because you are a video expert, among other things. But I think the focus for today is we're gonna flip the switch a little bit. I want to talk about podcasts. And I know you're on a podcast and we're talking about podcasts, which might be a little crazy for people out there, but we really have been seeing a huge shift from, YouTube is a big play. We know how important creating videos are and how much it'll help build trust and help you meet your customers where they are in the marketplace. But we haven't really talked about podcasts and how much we've been seeing a shift in engagement and how much it's helping to build trust on such a real level. So I'd love to pick your brain about podcasting, the do's, the don'ts. And I know you have some clients that are starting to actually kick off their own podcast. So I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to let you tell us what's going on in the land of podcasting.
Well, Alex, at some point we are going to flip the script and I want to ask you some questions about how the sausage is made behind the scenes on this podcast, because I think the customers who I help produce podcasts would love to hear some insights from you all who are actually doing it and producing it.
Sounds good.
We'll get there, but let's sort of set the stage for why podcasting? Why does it make sense? If you think about the viewing consumption habits on a daily basis, how are you personally consuming media?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I watch a lot of videos just because that's who I am. That's how I've always been. But I definitely listen to podcasts when I'm in the car. So when I'm driving to and from the office and when I have some downtime, or if I'm on a plane going somewhere, I usually am listening to podcasts. That's the new thing.
Yeah. And as much as I also love watching videos during the day, if I'm doing administrative tasks that I put my head down and I'm getting some work done, there's a good chance I'm putting on a podcast.
Yeah.
And so if we think about specifically for a B2B audience and you're asking yourself the question, what does business person who I'm trying to target do on a daily basis in terms of listening habits or viewing habits or media consumption habits? Well, there's a good chance that they are looking at a podcast or thinking of putting on a podcast when they're doing tasks like the tasks that I mentioned, the admin tasks. So if we are really trying to get the most out of our endless customers journey, build the most trust, meet our viewers or listeners where they're at. If you are a business and you realize my audience listens to podcasts, which you can do with some demographic research, then why wouldn't you make a podcast? I think one of the misconceptions behind making the podcast is it's going to be a lot more work than like a regular video is, but you should ask yourself the question, is it better to do a podcast just straight up and focus on that as the main factor of our video strategy? Because I think people forget that podcasts can be video as well. They're not just audio.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the podcast, quote unquote podcast that I listen to and watch, and I say watch because I watch most of it on YouTube, is a sports podcast that I put on Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings with my husband. We have it on YouTube as we're getting ready. We can listen, we watch, and then finish it because it's like an hour and a half long show. Mm-hmm. Finish it in the car on the way to the gym in the afternoon. It has become the only true appointment viewing that we have in our house, and it's podcast.
Wow. What a shift too, because I feel like back in the day it used to be you'd watch the news or you'd watch whatever sports channel on TV, and now it's a podcast. And it's so true because I do that too. I'm a big Joe Rogan fan and I watch Joe Rogan, but I watch his video podcast. I don't really listen to his podcast. I watch it on YouTube. That's sort of my fascination and the guests he has on, but I do the same thing. So it's definitely the new normal.
Yes. So if you're thinking, oh, podcast, how does that work within this strategy? It can be your primary video strategy.
Okay.
the customers who or the clients I'm currently working with, the goal is the we're going to do Big Five and we're going to address these topics in podcast format. Because if you think about the original way we were teaching Big Five back when, Marcus was writing articles, a lot of our case studies were writing articles. The most important part, or one of the most important parts of that article creation process was the content manager would interview subject matter experts on whatever the topic was, Big Five topic was. How is that different than a podcast?
It's really not. The difference is you get to hear the Q&A back and forth in real time versus somebody being off camera and having some graphics or some segments that basically trim those questions out and only have the answers. So it's just a different format, but still the same principles, it sounds like.
And for you, like you listening to a lot of Rogan, he has a lot of experts on from different fields.
Yeah.
What is the value for you in hearing that long form conversation directly from the expert versus reading it on paper?
Well, I definitely have ADD, so I think that helps a lot. But aside from my attention issues, no, seriously, there's something about the way that it's conversational, and Joe will ask a question or whoever it's just so relaxed that you almost feel like you're in the room with the people, and that makes it feel more real to me, I guess, is the best way I can describe it. It just feels like I'm part of the conversation instead of being spoken to or told what to think or do or say.
Yeah. And if you have someone who is asking really good questions and you can tell the person is comfortable with them, then it feels like a more authentic conversation you would hear on the street. And that combines everything we talk about with endless customers, the authenticity, the honest answer to a question, the different layers of answering a question. Because if you're answering the question, how much does X cost? Well, at X cost X, Y, and Z, but there are factors. Imagine if that was a conversation.
Right. That'd be so
It's
cool.
a very different thing. Or the podcast I was reviewing for a customer right before I hopped on here. The episode is public, private, or hybrid cloud, choosing the right one for you.
Wow. Very
comparison
cool.
right there.
Yeah.
Discussing that comparison in real time with an expert. So it's taking one step from a content creation process that has existed for years and just changing it to a recorded conversation that can be published.
It makes total
So
sense.
we're thinking about answering the question of, well, how are we actually going to do this? It's like a whole new thing. It's like, it's really not a new thing. You've been doing it. If you've been writing content, you have the process of someone interviewing you and then translating that to something else. You just take that interview, and it doesn't have to be a fancy setup right away. I think that's one of the things that people get hung up on is they have to have a setup that looks just like endless customers, or they have to have a setup that looks like Pardon My Take setup in the Barstool Sports office in Chicago, or they have to have a setup like Rogan. You don't need that setup. It can be simple. It can be just getting started on a Zoom call. Like I'm on a Zoom call right now. There's nothing fancy over here. It's just me on my laptop in my home office talking to you guys.
Right.
There should be no barrier to entry for anyone trying to do a podcast.
And you can always build off of it. That's a big piece is you can always build off of it and eventually work up towards getting the microphones or the studio set up or whatever those features are that you want to have. So strategically speaking, I want to just ask this because I'm curious if like B2B or B2C, if I'm a company and I'm thinking, do I do video? Do I do a podcast? How do I decide? What do you tell people in those moments or in those conversations when they're trying to lay out the strategy and figure out what's going to be best for their business or their organization?
Yeah, it's a number of things. It's okay, where is your audience? How are they consuming media? That's the first big factor. Is that. The other factor is do we have someone who can own the creation of the podcast? Just like we need someone who can own video, just like we need someone who can own written content, someone needs to own the podcast. And then I think a third thing is going to be, do we have someone who can be the consistent host and voice who's going to be asking questions?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Once we can answer those three questions and there's a clear idea of how this is going to function, then then we can go ahead and make a podcast. I think we also have to decide, like, if podcast is going to be the main source of content for us, which for some, I think it makes total sense. How are we going to repurpose that? Because a podcast episode can be anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 hours long.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have 2 hours of footage and you're only doing a single thing with it, then that's a missed opportunity.
Totally. Yeah, that's a huge missed opportunity, and that's definitely not something we do here at Impact with this podcast, because it's so critical for us to leverage these awesome conversations that we have across all different platforms and mediums so that we can meet people where they are. So if people are watching on Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever they're consuming the content, we're repurposing a lot of this, and that's something that we've been doing from the start because we knew it was important to do that. So there's all sorts of really cool AI tools that are out there too that can help you do this a lot faster and allow you to have a great workflow that you can make it repeatable and have a process that's like on a weekly basis. You could be creating a steady flow of content.
Yeah, take the transcript of the podcast, drop it into your favorite, either ChatGPT, Claude, whatever you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Ask it to create an article from it, edit the article with a human touch, or ask it like, all right, now that you've written this one article, are there other articles that can be written from this that weren't directly discussed as the main topic of the podcast? And
Totally.
what other big five ideas can come from this? So there's a lot that you can do with the transcript. There's a lot that you can do with clips from the podcast. Like, I know once this episode is finished, you guys will take this, clip it up, and make some shorts that make sense and publish the shorts as part of promotion for the show.
Right. Yeah, and we use Opus Clip for that just because it's you upload the episode and it tells you timestamps and it gives you a grade or a rating for each clip, so you can kind of get a sense of how it's gonna play with your audience and how your audience is gonna react to it. So it just makes it a lot faster, and then we can go in and pull these clips, edit them pretty quickly, make sure that it's human, make sure that we put our spin on it. But then it gives us more content, and it's really interesting on our YouTube channel. This show does a decent amount with numbers as far as the long form, but our shorts get like 5x the amount of views compared to the long form video itself, which is fascinating.
Yeah, can we keep on the behind the scenes thread of how this podcast functions?
Sure. Yeah. Let's pull back the curtain. What do you want to know?
Yeah. So I think if I'm putting myself in the shoes of the podcast creators I'm currently working with,
Mm-hmm.
they want to know, like, what are the biggest obstacles or hurdles that you guys have, and you and Austin both, because we know, Alex, like, you are the face of the podcast, but Austin is behind the scenes doing a great job. And I would love to know, what are some of the biggest challenges? Like, if you could name 3 challenges that you faced with this podcast and how you overcame those to produce it.
Yeah.
What would those be?
Yeah, great question. First and foremost, Austin is a huge part of the show. He's like the unsung hero, and it's
Love you, Austin.
we love you, Austin. It's definitely a team effort. So I am the face, but there's a lot of people that help make this happen. Carolyn does a lot of work as well. The whole marketing team has a hand on it. Nicole does a lot of the social media. So like there are a lot of moving parts behind the scenes. I'd say one of the biggest struggles, you said top 3, I can at least do one of the biggest struggles we have is really trying to keep the topics and the content fresh. So it's really easy to just regurgitate info and to keep having like similar conversations, but we really challenge ourselves to come up with fresh topics that are going to meet people where they are, that are going to resonate with our audiences, that are going to build more trust, but do it in like a not self-promotional way. So that's really a big piece, is finding the right topics and how we position them so that it makes sense and resonates with our audience. I think another hurdle that we tend to encounter a lot is getting SMEs on the show. So getting subject matter experts and getting pros on the show like yourself. Like, scheduling is just not the easiest thing to do. People are busy. You have a full-time job. We have stuff going on. So trying to lock down schedules and coordinate is definitely a big piece of the puzzle. I'm trying to think what else is a struggle. Attribution. Yeah. Austin saying attribution. Austin, get on the mic over there. Let's have Austin.
Get on the mic, Austin.
Yeah, let's have Austin hop in
Am I
here.
hopping on?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, I'd say probably really solid attribution of knowing, like, because we were posting on YouTube, our show, as well as, different audio platforms. Some of those audio platforms, you're not going to know who listened to an episode and then came and got interested in your company. They may tell you in the sales process, but you're not going to always have super solid concrete numbers from that attribution. But that's something, we're always working on ways to kind of not get around that, but figure that out, and talking to, potential customers and seeing how they heard about us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have noticed, because I pay attention to this stuff and I'm a little bit nosy. We have a peek behind the curtain here, a Slack channel that notifies anyone who's part of that channel when a new like sales qualified lead comes through or both of you comes through, as we would call it. And I have noticed more and more over the last year or so that there have been more mentions about the podcast than I have ever seen in my 5 years here from a video strategy that we've tried. So just from like a visibility standpoint, it feels like the podcast hits harder than anything that we've done before.
I agree. From a content play and a content standpoint, I feel like more people are mentioning it as part of their journey towards conversion or becoming a client or becoming a prospect, which is exciting because in the past it was really hard to like pin that down. And I think to Austin's point, attribution is a big piece where we love data here. Like that's our bread and butter. Everything that we do is data centric. When you track each touch point in the customer journey, it just allows you to optimize it and really see like if it's working or what isn't working so you can fix it. So like those pieces are huge for us. And I think that's something that we definitely struggle with. We want to have more data sets and it's hard just on the podcast side of it. So like what we use to broadcast the podcast, the analytics and data aren't quite as strong as like when you're in the back end of YouTube Studio. YouTube Studio has way more when it comes to, watch time and fall off and engagement and like click through rate and all that stuff. So there's a little bit more data there. But I think to your point, Lindsay, too, like we have these channels set up on purpose where we're looking to see what people are saying and how they're converting and what's helping them along their journey to get them excited to want to talk to us.
Yeah. When you're out in the wild and at like events like Impact Live, what firsthand feedback are you getting from the podcast or about the podcast?
So we've been doing this a little over a year now. It's been about a year and a month. And in the beginning, there wasn't a lot. And it's like anything else. When you first start off on these journeys, you have to build some groundswell or get some traction going. So it took a few months to get some traction and build the audience. But now it's really cool. We have people that come up to us and they're like, I listened to this episode and I learned so much, or you talked to Lindsay and she said all this really amazing stuff and we've been doing it. So we get a lot of people that come up to us now and say how much they love the show, how great it's been for them just to like listen and help them on their journey with endless customers and how it helps them in their day-to-day with their business. So it's definitely rewarding on that level that we know we're creating content that's meaningful and it's actually helping people. I think that's definitely a huge win for us.
Yeah. Alex, for you too, a bunch of, people who are hosting the podcasts that at the companies I'm helping with this, they're not used to hosting. They're not used to interviewing necessarily. They are, someone who is a brand new videographer and then someone who knows a lot about a subject, but is maybe not like, this is her first time really doing something like this.
Yeah.
So for people who are jumping into the host seat, what are some tips that you would give to them to make sure that they're letting the conversation shine?
So I can relate because I didn't want to do this when I was first asked or when it was first brought to my attention, like, hey, maybe you can host the podcast. I always had this running joke. It was like my dad joke. That's like, I'm always behind the camera. I'm not in front of the camera, like there's a reason for that. And I was very apprehensive. So if you're feeling that way, that's normal. It's totally okay. It is nerve wracking. And I think when I go back and look at the first couple episodes that I did, even the first like month or so of episodes that I did, it's almost laughable to me when I look at it, like how bad, quote unquote bad, I thought it was, just because I was still figuring it out. And I think that's the lesson, is the only way to really figure it out is you have to do it. And we say the same thing when you're filming, selling 7 videos, you're trying to do the big 5, like you just have to go. And Marcus talks about the don't stop rule, right? You got to like, even if you mess up, you got to just kind of push through and you learn how to navigate it over time. And it's like anything else with practice, you get better with it. So I would say, even if you're afraid, you just gotta go for it and give it a try. I also learned a valuable lesson in the beginning that was, how do I say this? I was trying to be so eloquent and like professional and use all these big words and sound so smart. And, it wasn't working. It just really wasn't working for me. And I felt like I was almost trying too hard. So I think part of it too was learning that like, I know what I'm talking about. I don't have to sound like I have a PhD. I can just talk and be myself. And I think once you find that comfortability and that like sweet spot of like what works for you, then you just lean into it more. And it's been working for me anyways. So
There's a podcast that I've listened to in the past called Talking Elite Fitness. Shocking that I would listen to fitness. And the person who is the expert on the show, his name is Ben Bergeron.
Okay.
And he has a host. And I think his name is Patrick, but this just goes to show you, I don't remember who the host's name was because Ben does all the talking. It's his expertise that is important. Like the conversation is controlled by one person, but people are listening to that podcast because Ben is one of the greatest CrossFit coaches of all time, and they want to hear his thoughts on training, on programming, on fitness, and everything else. And so the host in that instance is almost the unsung hero. Like they remember people remember Ben's notes, but I'm even struggling to remember this poor host's name. Like I don't remember. I think his name is Patrick. I don't know.
Yeah.
But he controls the conversation in making sure that Ben shines. And I think that's one of the things that if you're a content manager or videographer being the host of the podcast, it's almost okay if people don't remember who you are, as long as they remember the guest and the conversation that person had and that person's moment of like, oh yeah, like so-and-so did a great job on this podcast and I want to work with him because he spoke directly to something that I've been struggling with and I need him. It's almost like if someone listens to Talking Elite Fitness, they should walk away being like, wow, yeah, I want to buy Ben's programming. Like I want to be part of the CompTrain community. Like I want I'm picking up what he's putting down.
I can totally relate with that too, just because I think when I started out, I was trying to be the expert. I was trying to be the outspoken one. And I realized very quickly that I have all these amazing people on the show. I have people like you, Lindsay, and all these subject matter experts and pros that really know this stuff inside out. And my job is really to be more of the facilitator and ask the questions and provoke these conversations and like almost step back and let it happen. And once I think I learned that shifted or like changed the game for me. And it's really interesting because when I film, I come out of the film and production world. I used to do a lot of like documentary style or corporate videos where I would be behind the camera doing the same thing. I'd ask the questions to pull the information out to get the narrative that we needed for, the video or whatever the shoot was. So I was already doing it. I just didn't realize it. And it's like, yeah, I am on camera right now, but like, this is basically what happens when we're shooting too. I just am not in those particular videos compared to being in these now. So once that happened, it clicked for me. And I think it really helped shape the format of the show and how we have these conversations now.
Well, and this is a little bit different in that those types of conversations, because I've been there too, being the producer and prefer being the producer. It's two things. It's not live to tape, which if you're a video nerd, you know what that means.
Yep.
What essentially that means is we're filming this. You guys are the people listening to this. This is likely a lightly edited live to tape, meaning we shot it with the intent of it seeming live, but it's not. And there's little editing that goes on in the background of a live to tape production.
Right.
In a documentary or something that's a little bit more scripted or a like corporate video, you're more in control of what the conversation is. And that control, if you've if you've gotten into the let them theory right now, it's one of the like hot psychology books. You just have to let your expert talk. And you might be cringing on the inside, like, oh, don't do that. Like, let them like try to control the conversation. But that control is like a form of anxiety that we don't have control necessarily of what they're going to say. There's certain freedom in just letting the conversation unfold and letting the expert just do their thing. And I think a lot of content creators might struggle with that.
Yeah. Well, it's also, I'm going to pull in reference from the Endless Customers, the new book that's coming out soon. It's part of the 4 pillars. It's part of being more human. And I think with the way that social media has changed the game and the way that people consume content nowadays, people know how shoots are done and how things are done. So like there's the smoke and mirrors that used to be like, woo, this is so cool. Like people know what's up now. So I think the only way to be more human is to just keep it real. And that's what we're trying to do.
One last question before I take off the interviewer hat and give it back to you, because I realize like I'm being a control freak and controlling this interview a little bit.
Sounds good. I like it. Does this feel like your old TV days when you were
A little bit. A little bit, a little bit. It
Okay.
is definitely weird being the expert and not the person doing the interview. But you know, tables are turned a little bit here.
Yeah.
If you know, one of the things that we talk about a lot in endless customers is the content, publishing content consistently.
Mm-hmm.
And to do something consistently, you need an efficient and disciplined process. So if you were giving advice on how do you streamline a podcast creation process to someone who's just getting started, what would that advice be?
I think it's very similar to how you shoot Selling 7 and Big 5 content, where like you want to create a backlog of content to start out. So I wouldn't just shoot one episode and then put it out there and then be chasing your tail trying to shoot the next episode while one's going out. And we really try to get ahead of it. So we'll batch record if we can, and we'll shoot at least 3 or 4 episodes at a clip when, you know, schedules allow. So we try to position it that way where we have 3 or 4 episodes in the backlog that we're staging and editing and setting up so that we're ahead of the curve instead of behind it, because we put out 1 episode a week, but it's not just 1 episode because we also repurpose content. So the whole mix, if you want to know how we like roll it out, Mondays is the highlight, which we put out on YouTube. And that's like a shorter version, like a really specific clip from whatever episode. That's a teaser almost to get people excited. Tuesday, we put out a short that goes on YouTube Shorts and across all of our social platforms. Wednesday, the episode actually comes out, the full length, on both YouTube and also on our podcasting platform. So we have an audio and a video version. And then Thursday, we also release another short. And then if there's a third short, sometimes either Friday or Saturday, depending on the week and what's going on, we'll add another short into the mix as well. So that's every single week just with the podcast, which is, it sounds like a lot of content, but it's also, I think the big piece is bringing AI into the equation. So as we were starting to lay out what the calendar or like the schedule would look like for what we were releasing, we also started to go like, what tools can we use and what tools can we leverage to help us do this faster and more efficiently? And it definitely took a little bit. The first month or so was almost the proving ground, experimentation, and it's important to do that to figure out what's going to work best for, you know, your workflow and for your style. But once you get that dialed in, it basically becomes like a rinse, wash, repeat sort of like experience.
Any AI tools that the podcast creators out there should run to go check out right after they listen to this episode?
Yeah, top ones would be Autopod is huge. It's by a company called Lemon Squeezy, which is a silly name, but it's a great tool, so don't let it fool you. Autopod's huge from an editing standpoint. It's a Premiere plugin. I think it's like $20 a month. It's fairly affordable. And it basically, you have to set up your timeline correctly, but once it's set up, you push a button and it basically edits based off of the audio waveforms as to who's speaking. And it edits what would take me like 2 hours to edit for an episode. It does in about 2 minutes, which is pretty amazing. And it's not perfect. You have to go through and you have to obviously watch it and you have to fix and tweak, but it shaves off a substantial amount of time from editing. Another big piece for repurposing when we talk about social content and short form content, I said Opus Clip earlier, but that's a big one that we use. And then we also use GPT for the write-ups and for transcriptions. And basically what I'll do is I'll pull the transcript directly out of Premiere Pro. You can go to the text box in Premiere Pro, export that file, and then we upload it directly to GPT and say, read through this. We've created our own custom GPT specifically for the podcast. So I would recommend doing that too, but it knows the tone, the language, the voice, the style, and what the podcast is about. So we upload the transcript and then it gives us the descriptions and all the descriptions we need for YouTube and for shorts and things like that. But it also pushes out an article that we post to our website as well for the blog. So it does all the things. It's pretty impressive. So I think the suite, just to recap, is Autopod is huge. Opus Clip is a big one. And then ChatGPT. We love ChatGPT here.
And for distribution?
Yeah, so for distribution, we actually upload everything manually. So we do everything on YouTube for the most part. And then we are using Podbean right now to distribute the podcast itself, the audio. And the reason we went with Podbean, there's a few different options out there, but it just helps push it across all the platforms at once. So you upload to Podbean, You push, schedule for when you want the episode to come out, and it pushes it out to Spotify, to Apple Podcasts, to iHeart, to all the different platforms that you want to, that you like, you can choose to publish to. But we've also, this is like, we're getting really into the weeds here. We've been talking with Jess at HubSpot, because HubSpot has some really great new tools and integrations that they're rolling out, and we may be potentially switching to HubSpot. So if that happens, we'll have to revisit this. But right now we're on Podbean, potentially switching to HubSpot in the near future.
Yeah, and this isn't any different than what are the current tools you're using to edit any kind of video, like discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I always tell creators, especially in the video world, like the stuff that you use today may not be the stuff that you're using next year or the same time next year. You should always be evaluating tools, what's out there, what can make your life more efficient, what can help you do the tasks that you hate doing. And AI has just made that even more of a thing that you should be checking in on at least every 6 months at this point, the way the tools are developing.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend every 6 months at a minimum. It's changing so fast, and it's exciting, but it's also something that you do need to dedicate some time to. And that's something that Austin and I both try to take at least an hour or so a week, if not every other week, where we just go and scavenger hunt the internet to find whatever new tools are out. And you have to experiment with them. That's the other piece. It's like, you can watch a video and think it's really cool, and maybe see something or hear something that's like, oh, wow, I have to try this. It's going to be a game changer. And it doesn't always pan out. It doesn't. So we've tried, there's been a lot of tried and failed tools that we've used that they were working at one point and then they're not anymore, or we tried them and we just didn't like them because it wasn't going to work for our particular workflow. So I think, to your point, the more you can experiment and the more that you can focus some time to keep up with these tools, the better it's just going to help you do your job.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
Well, I'll stop hijacking the interview now. Are there anything that for me?
Yeah, I have some questions for you, definitely. So I want to hear about what's happening in the real world, on the streets. I want to know what's going. You get to interface with a lot of clients and with a lot of amazing companies and wonderful people. I want to know what they're up to, and especially when we're talking about podcasts, because I feel like this is becoming a more relevant conversation where people are curious, people want to know, people want to start their own podcasts. Do you have some like client examples you can share with us of people that are starting to do their own podcasts and are getting into it?
Yeah. So everyone that I'm working with who's doing a podcast right now are still in the very early stages, but I would love to shout out the teams at the Home Health Consultant who are doing podcasts. Right now they're releasing them once a month. And that's not a dig at them. It's, they have a wonderful content manager who not only publishes 3 articles a week, but she also makes Selling 7 videos and manages this podcast. So
that's a lot.
Being able to do all those things,
that's a lot.
I'm happy with once a month, and I think she's doing a great job. And they've launched 3 episodes at this point. So still very new, but figuring it out. And I think a podcast is a great medium for them because their industry is so complex. If you think about compliance in healthcare and what a loaded topic that could be, the dial certainly warrants a podcast type conversation. And
Absolutely.
then I got to shout out the team at ERP Suites. They have filmed a few podcast episodes. We're backlogging them so that when we do launch the podcast, we're not scrambling to create a podcast right after the first one gets launched. So we're still in the let's build the backlog phase. But I have to give Nate and Scott and the guests on the show so far a shout out for leaning in and really embracing this and rolling with it, even though, at the beginning things can feel a little bit messy and it's new and there's a lot of apprehension around it. But I think they're doing a great job embracing the conversations, and the episodes that I've watched so far are really in depth. So
that's exciting.
Teams who are currently in the very early stages of podcasts. So follow their journeys, give their podcasts a subscribe to boost those viewership and those ratings. And I have no doubt that they'll be successful with these.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too, that you just reminded me of. A good tip or something for people that are listening out there that are thinking about starting a podcast. It takes time. So it's one of those things where like you're not going to get the like instant results. The first episode that comes out isn't just going to start converting people or whatever, you know, your goal is. It's going to take a little bit of time. Like I said, we're a year and a month into this podcast now, and we're really just starting to get that serious groundswell. We just broke 10,000 downloads. We're starting to get more views per episode. It's starting to, I think part of it too is like the algorithms that are out there. It almost takes a little bit for them to go, okay, they've been around for a while. They're established. This isn't just like a flash in the pan. They're actually a thought leader. They're a substantial share in the marketplace, and it's worth checking them out. So
Right.
I think some of the advice is just stick with it and know that it's going to take a couple months to get the traction you want, but it's definitely worth it if you can keep up with it.
Yeah. And if anyone listening to this is familiar with the Ask You Answer and Endless Customers, that's true across the board. You would never hear me on a coaching call say, your strategy is going to work right away.
You're going to get a million views on your first YouTube video.
A million views on your first YouTube video.
Yeah, right.
No. There's so much nuance to establishing a content strategy, building a habit, putting it into practice, publishing, distributing, building an audience, promoting. It takes time and have to be patient. It's like a science experiment. You don't just like make a hypothesis and then do a quick experiment to see if it works. No, experiments are thought out. They're plans. You gather data for a period of time and you decide like how you want to continue.
Yeah, that's so true. We talk about this a lot internally, but I think this is something we can talk about here too, where it's also, you have to think about it in the funnel, right? So like there's top, middle, and bottom. And this play with the podcast is very much top, maybe a little bit of middle, but it's very much top of the funnel awareness play, where you're really starting to build trust and answer people's questions, problems, concerns, which goes back to, endless customers and everything we've been talking about. So it's really a great way to start building trust, but it's also important to, after you have everything you said, distribution, you have everything all mapped out. It's also important to think about, if people are interested in the podcast, what other follow-on pieces of content can you serve them? Can you give them to keep them engaged, to answer more of their questions, to start pulling them down the funnel a little bit more? And those are things that we are constantly testing, A/B testing, and working on here behind the scenes to just help people answer their most pointed questions. That's really what it's about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as a coach, what do you think about the podcast that we've been doing? Do you have any advice for us? Like as an expert, is there anything that you're seeing that you're like, you guys could be doing this better? I'm almost like asking for an audit of our own channel here, but I'm just curious as to what you'd say or what you think.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think to answer the question, I would say I would continue to challenge you guys to really lean into the industry disrupting side of content, right? Talk a lot about Big Five, and it's so important, and it is. But can we push the boundaries of our own discussions to be more on the cutting edge of like, no, like this is something that's fundamentally wrong with the industry. Here's specifically why. Here's how it can be fixed. Can we hit those topics harder? Would be the one piece of advice that I would say to go for.
I love that. Disruption, shock and awe. That's what we need. Cool.
But also build trust, like not do it in like a weird salesy way.
Not clickbaity.
Yeah.
Right. We don't want to clickbait or pitch or do sales stuff. That's another question. So we've really, I feel like we've done well with that. And I think it's an important piece for everyone out there listening is like, where do you draw the line on like becoming too salesy and pushing me, services, products, us, and making it way more about building trust and about meeting people where they are. So keeping it endless customers and not keeping it like self-promotional, basically.
Yeah, I think that the line is, we can make Big Five content, but there's also a point where you should be making sales enablement content. And what I mean by that is you should talk about your process and how you do things. And you don't have to talk about it in a way of like, we're the best at doing X, Y, and Z. It's no, like, we do it this way for these reasons. And here's what people have said about the process, and then put like insert testimonial here.
That makes sense. Yeah.
I think if we're not talking about the sales process or not talking about how we execute our services, what it feels like and looks like to be a current customer in our ecosystem, then we're missing out on a layer of fundamental content that can, help build trust with someone. I think about my team over at RoofSmart, and they have a bunch of articles, RoofSmart up in the Seattle area.
Nice.
They have a bunch of articles that talk about the like what it's like to do an inspection with RoofSmart. How do you know that your team at RoofSmart is qualified to be working on your roof? How do you have the best installation? What's the process like for an installation? So they have taken a lot of time to answer these questions. They also have the article, is RoofSmart right for me? Or why would I choose RoofSmart?
Mm-hmm.
Helpful, unbiased, and as a customer in an industry that is wrought with distrust, I've seen people in their HubSpot portal who have read these articles and can say with confidence, these are closed won deals.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's big. That's a big deal right there. That's very cool. All right. We've covered a lot of ground, and I love that we flipped the switch a little bit. I love that you were doing some of the interviews today. I felt like this was a really great conversation.
Feel at home in my element.
Clearly we know, for people out there that don't know, Lindsay used to be a TV host and used to do a lot of sports reporting and producing and all sorts of stuff back in the day. So Last question, big question. This is my favorite part of the show. What's the one thing that people should be taking away from this conversation today, especially if they're thinking about starting their own podcast, whether they're B2B, B2C, doesn't matter. What's the one thing?
The one thing they should be taking away, and if my customers are listening to this or the people I work with are directly listening to this, they're going to eye roll hard because I tell them this all the time. The one thing they should be taking away is that you shouldn't have a barrier to entry or perfection paralysis of starting a podcast. If you want to do it, make a plan, rip the Band-Aid off, do it. The first episode is going to be the worst episode you ever make.
And it's only going to get better from there.
Only going to get better.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, Lindsay, thank you for your insights and thank you so much for being on the show. We love having you.
It's a pleasure, guys. Enjoy being here.
All right. And for everybody there watching and listening, good luck starting your podcast. Thanks for checking out our show. This is Endless Customers. I'm your host, Alex Winter. We'll catch you on the next episode.